Okay, so last week you started to make your main vessel shape, so you could have had the more cylinder looking one, the egg shape with your two slip pots put together, and you could have had that on its side or upright, and I've just marked where the hole might be just to remind you. Or you could have had the flat shape, and remember this doesn't necessarily have to be a square, that's just how we're going to show you. Okay, so I've got the shape from last week here. I'm going to start with this one. Okay, and I'm going to show you today how to add texture and any other areas that you're going to apply. So it could be that you've done some starfish, it could be that you've done some tentacles in Geiger style, and hopefully some little bits of coral as well to fill in. So I'm going to show you first of all how to add texture, because you might find that it's best to add texture on your base first before going on to apply things, because it could be that you need texture all over the area that you're going to apply to. So we've got some tools, we've got also tools that you wouldn't necessarily think are going to be used in that way, and hopefully I'll start to show you how you can mimic these underwater textures by adding in impressions. So things like using knives, not necessarily to put in, I'll show you quickly, in that way, but rather on their side to create different shapes is quite useful. Remember from year 7 we showed you, that pen's not very good, look, someone's chewed it. We showed you how to push in and give different shapes from different pens. As well, you've got different clay tools. Now these are quite cool as well, because you can actually gouge out a bit of clay with these as well and build in. And then of course you can just use it as an impression. The ends of paintbrushes can be quite nice for a smaller circle, and that can look really cool if you do quite a lot together, as if there's sort of coral built up. And then obviously you have, this isn't the greatest, stiffest brush, but you might want to add in some texture with a stiffer brush just to build up sort of tiny little details. Okay, so I'm going to start by adding in with the end of my paintbrush a little bit of an area of texture here. So I'm going to build them just like stippling with your pens you would do to build up tone. Lots in one area, maybe spreading out as it goes into the other areas. Okay, I'm just going to check on the camera that you can see that okay from there. Okay, fabulous. So I'm just building up this texture because I want to apply a shape on top there, and it could be that in my design I've got an area of lots of little areas, bits of coral on that place there. Okay, and then if I wanted to do this by applying instead, I could also be adding in tiny little shapes, scoring and slipping them on, and I can build up texture that way as well. I'm not going to score and slip right now, because you can imagine to add in all of these with scoring and slipping would take ages, and you'd probably have understood what we mean by now, but you can build up texture like that as well. Let's get it in focus. Okay, perfect. So a lot of you will have done Geiger style tentacles, because this is what we asked you to follow and asked you to do. So I'm going to put that over there, and then I'm going to show you how to make a tentacle. We're going to start by making a coil. Okay, we don't call them sausages, we call them coils. So I've got a piece of clay here. If you hadn't got a piece of clay that looks a bit like that, you can just take a piece of clay off your big pile if you've got a big area of clay, and you could start to just shape it a little bit more like that, and then from there onto your hessian. And I've always been told in rolling pastry that you always go from the middle and push outwards to make sure it's nice and even. And if you have one finger low and one finger higher, it's going to uneven it, so just making sure that your fingers are even as they go along. Okay, just carefully peel it off the hessian. Obviously it might have marks from the hessian in, but we can sort those later. You might actually like them on one side, because it, can you see as it bends, it actually makes it look quite tentacle like as it's going round, but you can add those yourself if you prefer. So once it's off the hessian, you might find that you want it to be slightly thinner at one end, because tentacles, whenever we draw them as well, they get smaller and everything, because, you know, like a plant, it gets smaller as it grows out. That's just natural form and how that is. Okay, so I'm just going to carefully in my hand roll it to a point. Okay, and remember, we can smooth all of this out if you want to, but you might not want to, because it actually, that happy mistake happened where it looked like the underside of a tentacle anyway. Okay, so smoothing it out nice and smooth, and now you can start to build up how you want it to maybe curl. I love how clay naturally goes into a curly sort of swirlness and it's actually much easier to work out a tentacle in clay than draw it, obviously, because it's 3D. So you could build it into a tentacle a bit like that. You could, I'm just going to undo it a little bit, you could have had it so it bends, in fact I'll do another one. You could have had it so it bends a bit differently at one point. And then what I'd say is, again, always before you start applying, add a bit of extra texture on. So maybe the underside of the tentacle, if you didn't like the Hessian, could have little dots at the end of a paintbrush on it. And this bit can be quite tricky but really effective. If I just leave that to one side, I get myself some spare clay, roll a tiny little sphere. You can even start to push in your paintbrush to create this effect. And maybe some of you guess what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to get an even smaller tool if I can find one. In fact, I'll do it bigger so you can see with a paintbrush, because I don't have a smaller tool. I'm sure you will on your desks. So say if I've got my sphere and I push my paintbrush in, okay, take it out. It's a bit, it's quite wet, this clay, so hopefully yours has dried a little bit. And you can create a little sucker. And then obviously I wouldn't put this one, it's a bit big, I think it would be better a bit smaller, but you could build those up along, and of course you must score and slip it. But I think just adding that extra detail before you add on the applied sucker detail, I just think it adds more to it. Another thing with natural, anything natural, is vary the size of things. So say if I put one next to it that's slightly smaller, another one here, you might be looking at this and think, actually miss, I'd prefer it if it was also flatter. So again, once you've rolled your sphere, you can flatten it off a little bit. You might even want to put it on there as it is like that, and then maybe get your knife and you push in your smaller area of detail. But again, of course, scoring and slipping. So that could look quite effective. Just do one in my hand as I go. Pressing on, adding in the detail. And then of course, the end piece, what I would suggest is before you start adding in all your detail, just make sure you've got a nice flat base like this. There we go on camera. Because of course you're going to score, rough up, score, put that on the flat now, otherwise it's going to go wrong. And then we would slip both, adding it on, and then of course you can change the orientation of it, and you must score and slip. You can see that I'm smoothing it down. You would do that as well, just to make sure it molds in. If you want it to look like it's molded in, it would look better, but you must score and slip it. Okay, so that's the tentacle. If I just make another one quickly, if you're making smaller ones, you don't even have to use the mat. Okay, so could make another one, and the more that you have around an area, the better it will look, the more natural. Variation, that's a really, really good way to remember. Natural means variation, means smaller, larger, etc. Okay, I'm going to leave that video there, and I'm going to show you a starfish on the next video.